Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? My guest today is Peter Zeihan. Peter is a geopolitical strategist who combines his expertise in demography, economics, energy, politics, technology, and security to help his clients prepare for an uncertain future. Before founding his own strategy firm, Peter helped develop the analytical models for Stratfor, one of the world's premier private intelligence companies. He's also a critically acclaimed author whose first two books, The Accidental Superpower and The Absent Superpower, have been recommended by Mitt Romney, Zakaria and Ian Bremmer. And his third book, Disunited Nations, The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World, hits bookstores tomorrow. This is one of the best conversations I've had on this program. Just from an educational standpoint, it was phenomenal. Peter's book is one of the most informative and engaging of any I've read in the 3 years of doing this podcast. It was so comprehensive that my biggest concern was how to structure it in a way where all of you could get the most out of the 2 hours we spent together. And although there's no substitute for reading the book, and in case it isn't already obvious, I highly recommend you read the book, I do think this episode really nails it. The first half is all about laying the foundation for what this world we're entering is going to look like, how it differs from the world we've inhabited since the end of World War II, and what sorts of forces are going to be driving the changes that we can expect to experience over the next few decades. Towards the end of the episode, we start to get into specific countries and regions and what sorts of changes we can expect to see, both economically and politically, but also socially, geographically, and militarily in the not-too-distant future. My only goal during this episode was to try and make this the most comprehensive overview of Peter's work and outlook as I possibly could, to help you understand just how abnormal our world has been over the last 70 years, and what a return to a more normal world by historical standards is going to look and feel like. And this has consequences, not only for governments, but also for business people, retirees, and especially for anyone living or invested in countries that have been the primary beneficiaries of the American-led international order of the past 3 generations. The future that Peter lays out is one of both risk and opportunity, and we explore many of those opportunities in the second half of this episode, including those dealing with Turkey, Argentina, and perhaps most importantly, the United States, and what Americans and their nation's regional partners can expect to experience in the scramble for security, resources, and power in the world to come. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode with my guest, Peter Zeihan. Peter Zeihan, welcome to Hidden Forces.
It's great to be here.
Peter, you are a superstar, man. I was telling you this just now, and the one time we spoke briefly by phone, that you're probably the most requested guest from anyone that I've ever had on the program. I mean, for months, probably going back years, people have been requesting you on the show.
I'll try not to ruin the ride.
Well, I listened to some of your stuff. I mean, you're phenomenal. I read your book. It's engrossing, and it's written in a very sober way, and I think that's what makes it a little bit even more anxiety-provoking. Now, if you're an American, there's reason to be optimistic. You know, it's not all, it's not all bad, and the return to the pre-order world. If you're also a Greek citizen like me, it's unnerving, and I do want to get into the stuff on Turkey. But maybe you can fill our audience in first. Who are you? How did you get here? How did you develop this skill set? And how much do you read?
Well, I'm a geopolitical strategist, which is a fancy way of saying I help people figure out what the world is going to hold for them down the line, good, bad, or indifferent. My background is in private intelligence. I worked for a firm called Stratfor for 12 years, and I was one of the very few people that they had ever hired who did not have a regional specialty. So there was an energy team and a Mideast team and a former Soviet team and so on. And over the years, I did time in all of the regions, and I evolved to become their global analyst. So I was the only person who was dealing with things that were coming in from all kinds of different angles, from different teams and different topics. And as we discovered, because I was a generalist, I was really the only analyst they had that tended to not get in a fight with clients, because I didn't have a horse in the race. I didn't have a specific topic that I tried to make everything about. So I became the face of the company before clients, and I kind of built this tapestry about how when you factor in everything that's in the international system, and if you pull a thread on one side of that tapestry, things on the other side move. And that movement is what makes geopolitics geopolitics. Well, about 9 years ago, I walked out of the company and I took the tapestry with me. And now I slice out bits of it as are relevant for whoever happens to be in front of me.
You have a great, the very first chapter, I don't know if it qualifies as the introduction, maybe it's the preface. You talk about Matt Baker, who was your boss at Stratfor. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's a really interesting chapter because it shows both of your projections in the early 2000s. Tell me, give our audience, first of all, why did you lead with that in the book? And what did you want to convey by telling us how you saw the world back then, and then how you proceed to explain to us what sort of world we're stepping into now?
Well, it really comes in two pieces, one official and one very unofficial. Officially, projections, forecasts, they're difficult, and the hit rate is pretty low for people in my field. Most people get trapped up in ideology, so I wanted to make sure that everybody understood exactly where I've been coming from for the last 20 years. And the big difference between Matt and myself is he was more into the guns and I was more into the butter. He thought that the world was all about security. I thought it was all about economic activity. And what made us such a powerful pair back in the day is we were pretty good at playing off of one another. And we're now evolving into a world where it's kind of our two views are kind of blending into where we're going, which is honestly a far darker outcome than I think either of us would have thought of 20 years ago. Unofficially, I wanted to make people understand that even for an American who's going to be relatively insulated from most of the changes that are coming, is that this is still deeply personal. We're talking about the greatest changes in the human condition that we have seen at least since the Columbus expeditions. The changes that we are living through right now aren't just dramatic, and they aren't just deep and systemic. They are going to change the nature of everything that we thought was possible. And for most people in most countries, that is not a step forward.
So I guess this is also kind of a way of asking you, why this book? Why now? Is this why you've written this book that you've read? And how does this differ from the stuff that you've written already, like The Absent Superpower and some of your other books?
Yeah, so this is book 3. The first 2 books, Accidental Superpower and Absent Superpower, detail how we got to where we are, the international crises that Americans are most likely to notice and care about, the shale revolution, how it's changing the American industrial space, the wars that will erupt around the world. It's not that these aren't big issues, it's that they're relatively constrained in time and space. My plan for my third book was to talk about how all of the changes in the international system and the collapse of the international order are going to change global agriculture and global finance and global manufacturing and transport and everything else. But we then had a second Obama term where a whole lot of nothing got done in the international system, and it really just started to fall apart from neglect. And then we have Donald Trump, who is kind of taking a sledgehammer to what's left. And the pace of change has really accelerated. Disunited Nations is about the countries that we think of as the owners of the future and really detailing why they're going to collapse and how it's another set of countries that will actually rise to dominate the human condition. I thought I had a few more years to get this book out. And so book 3 kind of got pushed to the side, and book 4, which is Disunited, got brought forward simply because we're running out of time. If just the publication schedule in order to get a fourth book out, which, takes a year to two, it's going to happen that soon. We really are in the end of days as regards the world that we know, as we think of the global order and global trade and global finance. This is the end of it, and we are about to experience something very, very new, or if you're historically minded, something very, very old.
So there's so much to get into. Peter, I mentioned to you that the rundown I came up with for this conversation is 23 pages long, and you have scorecards, report cards for every single one of the nations that you profile. Of course, there are other nations that come into the book as a result of those profiles, and there are nations that are better positioned in this new world, and there are those that were well positioned in the old order that are going to lose out in this one, and new emerging spheres of influence. So I think that maybe the best way to get into all of that is to give people a sense of what was this order, how did it come about, and how, in some sense, abnormal was it in terms of shaping the world that we consider to be normal today?
Well, really, it all comes down to fear, and not like some sort of irrational fear like, aliens or coronavirus or anything, but a perfectly reasonable fear. The American forces at the end of World War II were sweeping across Europe, and when we met the Soviets, we realized that they had conquered something like 30 times as much territory as we had in the same amount of time, and the sheer volume of people that they had killed along the way, it was freaking intimidating. So the Americans knew that if it came to a straight-out slugfest with the Soviet Union right after the Germans fell, that we were going to lose and lose badly. We didn't have the nerve. We didn't have the capability. We were on the wrong side of the planet. We didn't have the logistical potential. And the countries that we would have used as allies in that sort of fight had really spent the last 500 years at each other's throats. It was not exactly the sort of alliance that encouraged confidence. So the Americans had to come up with a means of motivating everyone who had seen what the Soviets had done to stand against the Soviets nonetheless. So we Americans did something that we're pretty good at. We made it about money. We created a global system where anyone could go anywhere at any time, purchase any raw commodity, ship it home, metabolize it into a finished good, and then export it primarily to the American market for hard currency. This is something that even at the height of their empire, the Brits couldn't do because there were always parts that the Germans or the Chinese, the Japanese controlled. At the end of the war, the U.S. was the only Navy, and we put it at the service of the global commons, which was put at the service of individual economic growth in individual countries. All you had to do was be on our side versus the Soviets, and if push came to shove, serve as cannon fodder. That was a deal that war-torn Europe and war-torn Asia jumped on, and that gave us everything from the Japanese alliance to NATO. This is the world that we know, and it lasted for a good 40 years. What's unique about the world we're in right now is the Cold War ended back in the early 90s, but the Americans never bothered to update their system. We, in 7 straight electoral contests, went with the candidate who wasn't interested in foreign affairs. And so the global system was just allowed to ride. And it was getting ever less attention from the United States, ever less maintenance. It started to fall apart. Countries within it thought that this was the new normal, that the US would just continue doing all the heavy security lifting for everyone. And so American politics changed with it. And eventually that brought us to Barack Obama, who did nothing, and Donald Trump, who was destroying. This is where we are now. We're at the final moment of this system. The global order that the Americans created to fight the Soviets was the most atypical period in human history because the chief empire, if you want to use that word, didn't use it for economic imperial goals. We used it to subsidize a broad alliance globally in order to fight a single power. And then we forgot about it. And now here we are.
So you're saying it was an economic bribe meant for security purposes for the United States?
We pay you to be on our side.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about this political inertia, which made it difficult, or what really explains the fact that the American foreign policy establishment and government weren't able to really pivot from the end of the Cold War to this new world, beginning really with Bush, because Bush had begun the process of laying out what was then referred to as a new world order, and there were other terms used to describe it. Why did that ultimately falter, and what accounts for the inertia that followed in the years after?
Yeah, you remember the New World Order and the Thousand Points of Light? Yeah, that was George Herbert Walker Bush, George Sr.'s attempt to get Americans to have an open, honest national conversation with themselves about the sort of world that they wanted to live in. How do we take this alliance, the greatest in human history, and play it forward? And so, of course, we voted him out of office. And we went with Bill Clinton, who saw himself as a leader of domestic renewal. And I don't mean to blame Clinton or even the American populace. Americans were tired of the Cold War. Living for a whole generation under the threat of nuclear annihilation, that gets a little wearing. And we thought we had escaped history. And then we escaped history again with W, and we escaped history again with Obama, and now we're with Trump. This is a natural progression. But it does mean that since January of 1992, the American foreign policy and security establishments haven't really gotten any meaningful guidance from the president as to what they should value, which allies matter, how they should go about doing the things that allow the United States to be the premier power. You fast forward that for 30 years. And I mean, can you imagine what your life would be if the last professional guidance from your boss you got was 30 years ago? I mean, we now have an entire generation of professionals in the military, intelligence, and foreign policy communities that have never had any sort of meaningful guidance on what the United States should be or what it should do or how it should get there. And so we get bloating in the Defense Department. We get a foreign policy system with the State Department that seems rudderless because it largely is. The intelligence community hasn't been told what is to prioritize, so we try to do everything as we did back in the late 1980s. Well, in the late 1980s, the United States was the superpower, sure, but it was very clear who the bad guys were. One of Herbert Walker Bush's last commands on his way out the door was that, the Soviet Unions are no longer the bad guys. We need to prepare for a new world. And rather than tell us what that new world is, rather than give him the chance to tell us what that new world would be or what it could be, he was booted out.
He was, yes. So I have a question about that. Do you think that we would have been better off with a second term under HW?
I'm a foreign policy guy, so I obviously feel that way. I don't mean to denigrate Bill Clinton. He did something that really no one in American history has done with the balancing of the budget. Unfortunately, that did not stick, but that was a huge accomplishment, and only somebody who was focused on domestic affairs could have done that. But having a framework for what we wanted to achieve and back in 1992 would have been brilliant, because we were at this pure unipolar moment where everyone in the world was looking to Washington. And then Bush fell and it was just silence.
So what were the first signs that this new order was coming unglued?
There have been many along the way. And honestly, the day that Bush fell and when Bill Clinton came in and his first dozen actions were minor ideological points like gays in the militaries, for example, it was pretty clear that this is not a big picture vision guy. But if you want to talk about the points where it was very clear we were past the point of no return, you'd have to go to 2001, so 10 years later. We had three things that happened in less than a year. The 9/11 attacks, in which it became very clear that even some of our most stalwart allies weren't going to assist the United States in the way the United States expected to be assisted. We had the EP3 incident with the Chinese, where, the Chinese are arguably the country that has benefited the most from the changes in the international system. We ended the empires, we allowed them to access raw materials and end markets and become the workshop of the world. But when they forced down and crash that EP3.
The EP3 spy plane.
Yeah, exactly. It was back in 2001. American defense planners are like, wait a minute. Everything about your system is made possible by the American security guarantee. And now you're saying that we want you to keep doing what you're doing, but give us all of East Asia? I'm sorry, that doesn't fly. And then the third piece, of course, was the launch of the euro, which seems very peaceable until you realize that the primary rationale for the euro currency in the first place was to carve an entire section of the world out away from the US dollar system. So here we've got 15 countries in Europe who are only existing as modern, united, free democracies because of what the United States did in World War II and with the subsequent order, and their thanks is to carve chunks out of the world for themselves. Now, it's not that I don't see all these different points of view. I do. But for Americans who were still doing all the heavy lifting, who were still paying for the system, it seemed rude And so starting in 2001 and then picking up speed ever since, Americans bit by bit by bit have lost interest in and faith in the international order. And now we're to the point where the US is just, letting the ceiling of civilization fall. And for the countries like the Europeans, like the Chinese, like the Saudi Arabians, this is going to be a disaster because there is nothing about their economic and political systems that is sustainable without the Americans holding the center. And the Americans are leaving.
So there's so many things. I mean, specifically 9/11 and the Bush administration policy, the war on terror, that pivot, and the euro, those are worthy of their own discussions, and I'm sure we'll get back into them. What I really want to ask you is, or the way to kind of continue the conversation is to ask who were the biggest beneficiaries of the order, because that brings us into some of the losers of the world to come, or the world that we're stepping into now. But I want to make a quick interjection and ask if Turkey's recent actions in northern Syria, Rojava, Kurdistan, if that is another sign, because when I saw that, that seemed like a pretty big flag. The entire affair, not just Turkey's incursion, but also the letter that Trump sent Erdogan and Erdogan's response, that seemed to be another instance, or to me, the clearest instance that America was stepping away from the world. Where does that rank in this continuum of sort of signs, in your view?
Oh, it's definitely right up there. Key thing to remember that the United States has a military in excess of 1 million men under arms. Right now, there's only about 100,000 American troops that are stationed abroad. This is the lowest level of American deployment since the Great Depression. And at the rate that these numbers are going down, we're looking at the lowest force deployment before the Spanish-American War. So it's not the Americans are thinking about this or in the early stages of doing this. We're in the late stages of doing this. And in the Middle East specifically, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, the broad-scale withdrawal from the entire region, that leaves it to the local powers, whether out of opportunity or desperation, they're forced to take matters into their own hands. And in the case of the Turks just assumed that because the Americans under the order had always taken steps to preserve stability and in general get along with Ankara on anything that they wanted to do, they just assumed that the Americans were going to be moving in large scale and deposing the Assad regime. And when the Obama administration declined to do that, it was a shock. And when the Trump administration then says, we're going to pull out, but you don't do anything cheeky, it was almost a challenge. Because now Turkey is in this zone where the Iranians and the Russians are actively intervening and the Americans are doing nothing. And it's starting to sink in Turkey that if anyone is going to do anything to look out for Turkish national interests in their near abroad, it absolutely has to be Turkey because no one else is going to do it. And one of the things that we have forgotten in this world is that Turkey is not an Arab country. Turkey is not a European country. Turkey is Turkish. It is an independent pole in international affairs. It hasn't been since World War II. It has been subsumed into the American alliance network. But now that the American alliance network is no more, the Turks are realizing, a little belatedly, that their neighborhood to do with as they choose. Doesn't mean it's risk-free, doesn't mean that they won't have pushback. But if there is going to be a settlement in Syria that they like, they are going to have to be the ones who settle it and then be responsible for it. And what is going on in northern Syria right now is exactly that. The Turks are waking up, rediscovering the tools of power that are necessary to counter countries like Iran and Russia who have been agitated against the international order for so much longer. The Turks realize now that this is entirely up to them.
So that's a really interesting point and something I thought about often when I was reading your book, which is that, is there a tipping point? I mean, at what point do nations around the world quickly realize that they need to position themselves for this new order, that they just can't wait around, that there's a fast mover advantage to this? How does this play out? Where are we there?
One of the things about the global order, one of the defining characteristics is the Americans basically told the whole world that geography doesn't matter anymore. We're going to patrol the oceans for everyone, so you don't need a navy. We're going to guarantee raw material and market access for everyone, so you don't have to do that for yourself. And this enabled countries the world over to access raw materials and energy on one side and finished goods and consumer markets on the other side, and expand and develop and urbanize and modernize in ways they never could have before. Now, for the countries that could do that already, This was kind of a gut punch because these were the countries that were special before, and all of a sudden the Americans say, no, you're not special anymore. Now, the short list of countries that could function without the Americans, Japan, far and away the top of the list. Turkey makes the top 4. France does really well. So does Argentina. These are all countries that enjoy a degree of strategic insulation, a meaningful military structure relative to their challenges, and the ability to produce the goods or reach in a relatively easy fashion the resources and the markets that they need. These are the countries that are going to be rising up. Now, they're not all doing it at the same pace. Argentina is a special case when it comes to national dysfunction. The Turks have been out of commission for a century, and they're slow going and picking up the pieces and figuring out how to function again. But Japan and France have always been very aware of their strengths and have always been very resentful of their position in the global system. France, because they used to be a major power, and all of a sudden the United States brings in the Germans and brings in the Brits and brings in the Italians and everybody else, but shuts out the Russians and tells the French that, you can do whatever you want as long as you do everything that we say. It's kind of galling. And for the Japanese, we literally nuked them twice to make sure that they didn't step out of line. So they're being a lot more cautious. But those two countries are two countries that absolutely have right-sized militaries for their needs, and they're waking up the fastest. I would say that the countries that are slowest to recognize the change are the ones that have been banging their head against the order for so long. China has only been successful because the Americans have ended the imperial order and allowed global markets. The Chinese have never had the capacity to do that for themselves. They certainly don't now. Their navy is only capable of maybe capturing Taiwan. They can't protect super tankers in the Persian Gulf, much less cargo shipments going all the way to Europe or North America. They just utterly lack the capacity. But they're starting to believe their own propaganda, which is setting them up for a catastrophic fall.
Well, Peter, can I ask you something, just to clarify something for our listeners and for me? When you say banging their head against the order, these are also the countries that were the greatest beneficiaries of the order, correct? Just to be clear?
The countries that have benefited the most are definitely Germany and China. I mean, here are two countries that are geographically constrained. Anytime that they tend to have an economic moment, they scare everyone around them into forming a coalition to tear them down. And so their moments in the sun historically have been brief to non-existent. What really sets these two apart now is how integrated they've become with the wider world and with each other in an era where the Americans have removed security concerns from the table. Put those security concerns back on the table, and everything that has made the German and the Chinese systems thrive in the past 70 years really goes away overnight. So we're going to see some spectacular collapses in those two countries in the not too distant future. For banging the head against the order, the better countries to look at are probably Iran and Russia. Now, the global order was formed to face down the Soviet Union, so the Russians are pretty obvious there. But Iran, the United States doesn't use a lot of Persian Gulf oil, never has. What happens is the oil flows out of the Persian Gulf to fuel global trade. And global trade is what gives the Americans their alliance network, and the alliance network is what gives the Americans their security. Well, the Americans are now defining security differently. They've never really used the trade. Courtesy of the shale revolution, they don't care about the oil. So everything that's kind of kept the Americans bound to this region is now gone, which means that Iran has gone from fighting the order because the Americans are in charge of it to all of a sudden being one of the countries that is most dependent upon freedom of the seas. The Iranian Navy wouldn't do well in a bathtub, and it certainly can't protect outgoing cargo shipments. It's Americans that have allowed that to happen. I mean, the idea of the order was so holistic that the United States even protected the shipping of countries that it was bombing at the time. And so Iran has gone from a country that hates everything about the global order that the Americans lead to all of a sudden being one of its biggest beneficiaries. And the same goes for the Russians. The Russians export raw commodities, whether it's oil or natural gas or timber or iron ore or whatever it happens to be. All of that requires a placid international environment. So when the Americans step back and countries start taking matters into their own hands, these countries that have so reflexively fought everything about the international system for decades, all of a sudden are going to discover that they're two of the countries that are going to suffer the most when the Americans are gone. And I would love to be a fly on the wall in the Kremlin when the Politburo of Russia realizes that. They're not there yet. They're too stuck in their own ideology. They've been thinking this way for too long. But it's coming, and it's coming soon.
All right, so this now gets us to where I wanted to get us to. I mean, there was a lot of work to kind of build a foundation. I've kind of broken down these countries into, in some cases, pairs. In one case, a sort of isolated example, which is Turkey. I'll put it out here, and you can tell me if I've got it right, and we can continue. So the biggest beneficiaries in some case, a great case is something like China. China has been one of the biggest beneficiaries, along with Germany, for example. Saudi Arabia also, but in a different way. And China's fall in this new disorderly world is the opportunity of Japan's rise. These are sort of like light and dark, they're opposite sides. Germany is in a sort of triangle with Russia and France. Brazil and Argentina somewhat, and I'd love to talk about those two. Iran and Saudi Arabia you mentioned, and then there's Turkey, which could go in any direction. It could go towards Romania and Bulgaria. It could go towards the Eastern Mediterranean and start picking off Greek Aegean islands. It could go south into Syria and Iraq, and it could also go across the Black Sea and even over towards Iran. These are all things you talk about. I mean, there's so much detail in the book. Maybe we could start with China, because China has been the country that we've been told, and the big part of the foreign policy community has suggested for years, that the country would eventually be modernized and it would join the international community of nations. This has clearly not happened. And under the Trump administration, policy towards China has become increasingly and openly hostile and antagonistic. The latest situation with the coronavirus may just be the tipping point. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, but maybe we can open this conversation with China, one of the major beneficiaries of this order. What happens to China in this world? How does that relate to Japan's rise? And can we talk about the specifics like territorial viability, the geographics, demographics, agricultural capacity, resources, military capacity, specifically Japan's Navy, which one of the most interesting things about the book is Japan, because on the face of it, horrible demographics. Japan has to import practically, if not everything, but just because of their Navy, they're in a powerful position. So I'd love if you could maybe start us off with these two countries.
Well, it's pretty depressing. One of the things that happens when you modernize and industrialize is you bring in a lot of new inputs that make your industries more effective. So you bring in electricity and steel in order to make an industrial base, for example. I'd say there's no part of the Chinese system that is sustainable without ongoing deep international connections. This is a country that, while it has some resources, is not exactly resource rich, and it certainly doesn't have enough for 1 billion people. But the single biggest impact that is just going to be so dramatic that it's going to be painful is that about 80% of the world's calories that are produced with imported inputs, whether that happens to be diesel fuel or fertilizer, pesticide, that whole package. And China is now the world's largest energy importer. So there is no version of a world where the Americans are not providing the security in which the Chinese export machine continues, and honestly, where the Chinese diet is able to survive in its current form. So you're looking at a catastrophic reduction in the quality of life in China, complete with going back to the famines that predominated in the world before 1960. Remember that the Chinese were admitted to the American-led order when Nixon went to China and met with Mao. We turned them against the Soviets, and it worked out great all around. But under President Xi, the Chinese, I don't want to say anything as, gauche as they've forgotten their place, but they seem to have forgotten why they were able to get to where they are and how central the Americans were to that. And it's not that the Americans are setting up to punish the Chinese. The Americans are just done. We're leaving. We're just dropping the ball, and there's no one with the capacity to pick it up. So you look at a country like China, and you've got the one-child policy. So there are no consumers. That workforce is becoming thin and worker costs are going up. You look at their energy markets. They import roughly 80-85% of what they need. That goes away. You look at their agricultural markets. They can't maintain the food output that they've got right now. That means they've got too many people, even as they're aging into mass retirement. You look at their military structure. Sure, they've got a lot of ships on paper, but they don't have the capacity to reach beyond the first island chain. They can't guarantee their own trade, much less become a global hegemon. The Japanese have almost none of these problems. They're on the first island chain. They're not mainland. They're facing east. They're not constrained. They've got a blue water navy that's worthy of the name. It's the second most powerful navy in the world. Their needs are a lot.
Just for listeners, Peter, I just want to, you're saying so many great things. First of all, just tell our listeners what a blue water navy is and why it's important in the context of this conversation. So people, because most people don't know what that is.
A blue water navy is basically one that can sail almost anywhere around the world. The Chinese Navy really only has a range of about 1,000 miles. Now, they do have a handful of surface combatants that can go further than that, but not without any sort of significant support. In addition, they've got to, if they want to go anywhere important, they've got to sail by a lot of rival countries: Korea, Taiwan, China, Indonesia, Singapore, Pakistan, India. This is problematic. Whereas the Japanese, if they want to reach the Western Hemisphere, all they have to do is set sail, and there's no one between them and the west coast of the Americas. So the Japanese have a higher capacity, they have lower need, they've got greater reach, and they don't have to conquer anyone along the way. It's just easier. You add in the fact that their navy is blue water, and that means they can engage the Chinese at the time and place of their choosing in order to extract the maximum pain or the maximum concessions. It's
because
really,
they can sail away from the Chinese shore. They don't have to be exposed. They can sail away and sink Chinese ships along trade routes and basically cripple the Chinese capacity to import anything.
Yeah, absolutely anywhere they want. Now, if I was a betting man, I would say that they'd probably do that somewhere in the Indian Ocean, where there's absolutely no possibility that the Chinese can provide any sort of land-based support. That would be the easiest, no muss, no fuss. Any sort of war would probably be over in a few weeks.
So this is great because I want to help listeners get a sense of the visual map here, because that trade route is super important, not least because it's an energy route. Because you mentioned, I think earlier when we were talking, the United States doesn't rely on Middle Eastern oil. And actually, it would be great if we even had a chance to get into a conversation about the revolution in shale oil and natural gas that's happened in the United States and what that's done for the U.S.'s energy independence, and maybe talk about the refining process also and kind of integration of those supply chains. But the Chinese are heavily reliant, as is the rest of Asia, on Middle Eastern oil. So how does that work? In a world where the U.S. steps away and the U.S. Navy is no longer guaranteeing the security of those supply routes, of those trade routes, what happens there? Who fills the vacuum? How do the Japanese, for example, fill that vacuum? And how do the countries in the region jostle for positioning there?
That's a really messy question. There are very few countries that have the naval capacity to even reach the Persian Gulf in any sort of meaningful volume. So you've got the Brits, the French, maybe the Turks, but that's largely because they border the area via land. The Japanese, in an absolutely ideal scenario, the Chinese, and that's about it. So what'll probably happen is, without the Americans to limit competition among the local powers, is eventually you'll get a fight between the Saudis and the Iranians over the future of the region. But it's not like outside powers can just sit by. Oil is not something like, oh, we're not going to need any for the next 6 months, so we'll just wait for this to sort out and deal with the winter. No. If you want fuel, if you want electricity, you've got to go, and you've got to go now. You've got to maintain a supply. So you'll get all these powers who can maybe just barely reach the region, but can't really impose a reality on it in the way the United States can. Keep in mind that the United States has had an aircraft carrier battle group in the Gulf almost constantly from 1950 until 2015. It's only recently that we've stopped doing that. No one else in the world has an aircraft carrier battle group. I mean, one American aircraft battle group is nearly as powerful as the combined navies of the rest of the planet. So it's not like anyone can just go and impose a new reality just because they're there. That, and they're not all going to be on the same side. So you'll get 3, 4, 5 different powers in the same naval footprint trying to take control of whatever oil or take delivery of whatever oil they possibly can while the two oil producers are shooting at one another. This is, in a word, messy. And there is no way there is going to be enough crude for everybody in a world where the United States is not maintaining the security situation.
Well, what you're also describing to is like really make the point is that not only may there not be enough oil, but the supplies are extremely volatile. They're uncertain, especially in the event of a full-blown war of attrition between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, because on both sides, a primary target will be the oil production of the other side. I mean, it's just kind of an obvious situation. You take out the other side's economic lifeline.
So I could go in two directions here. One would be to ask what the dynamics are between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because you make a great point in the book, which is that Saudi Arabia doesn't really care necessarily about ruling the Middle East so long as they prevent Iran from doing it. I would like to talk about that, but maybe we can just go back a little bit to where we were on China, because you mentioned fertilizers, and which kind of gets us a little bit to agriculture. China's capacity to feed itself. Talk to me about that. First of all, how do we think about the U.S. breadbasket, the Midwest, for example? How does that compare to what China has, given the size of its population? And what are the Chinese looking at in terms of food security?
Sure. Well, the U.S. Midwest is the greatest agricultural basin in the world. Not only is it arable, not only is it in the temperate zone, it takes moisture from two different systems. From west to east, you've got the jet stream. And while the jet stream moves from year to year, and sometimes you have drought years and sometimes flood years, it's not alone. You also have the Gulf system that sends tropical moisture that, of course, Texans know as hurricanes. But by the time you get to Iowa and Kansas, it's just rain. It's pretty rare for an agricultural basin to have two different precipitation systems, kind of a monsoonal boost and then a more regular system. You throw in a winter insect kill, and that means you force soil decomposition upon the land. You kill all the bugs, you kill all the weeds. It's kind of free fertilizer and herbicide. The Chinese don't have anything like that. All of China only has a single moisture source. Northern China is remarkably thin soils, and it's backed by a desert, so you get droughts followed by floods pretty regularly. You go further south in the country, you get rugged terrain where agriculture is a lot more difficult and the costs of input are higher. But if you want to bring this to the modern era, with the shale revolution, the United States is a net exporter of all the things that agriculturalists need. Fuel, pesticides, herbicides, the entire chemical suite. China is an importer of all of it because it has to be. It doesn't have the energy production. It imports the vast majority of their fuels. It imports all of the raw commodities that go into a fertilizer industry. So without trade, you've got to look at what fertilizers and chemical pesticides and things like them have done for us. When the world industrialized for the first time back in the late 1800s, we saw per acre output of foodstuff increase by a factor of 4 because of these new additives. Well, it doesn't take a genius to say that when you take these additives away, we're going to see something moving in the opposite direction. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have a hard 80% collapse, but let's say it only goes down by half. That's a hell of a population correction.
So, I mean, that naturally brings up a question. Well, first, so what is it, 1/20th or 1/12th the amount of food production that the United States produces is what China can produce with its agricultural model? Is that right?
It really depends upon inputs. One of the things to keep in mind about China's financial model is that it's not profit-driven, it's outcome-driven, usually political. So they will print a lot of currency and they will throw whatever possible financial resources they need in order to force the output that they need. And so they over-fertilize, they over-pesticide, and so on. Overall, and it really depends upon which crop you're talking about inputs that are about 5 times the volume of what we use in the United States.
Well, they've also paved over a lot of the farmland, haven't they? I mean, which goes back to the point about directives.
Their best farmland by far has become urbanized, yes.
Yeah, they've done a lot to wreck that country. So what does this mean for the future of the Chinese Communist Party and their capacity to maintain control of China if they're going to face such food insecurity, and if they cannot control the security of their trade routes? How do they manage this?
Well, spoiler alert, not well. The Chinese Communist Party has known a lot of these problems were coming for the last 25 years. And every time they thought they had a moment to kind of breathe, they've put in a small-scale reform program to try to make the system work a little bit better, but it has always generated political backlash. And since ultimately their entire financial and agricultural system is geared towards political outcomes, they immediately backed away. So the distortions have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. At the same time, their international exposure has gotten more and more and more. And their demographic situation has gotten worse and worse and worse. So we really are well past the point of no return. At the same time all that has happened, the folks at the top of the political party have realized that they're gunning for a real political crisis. And since they didn't think that economic reforms would get them to where they needed to, they decided to go the other direction and politically centralize everything and basically make their next premier the equivalent of one of the Chinese emperors of old, and that is Chairman Xi. Well, we're now in a situation where Xi has consolidated more power unto himself than any Chinese leader in history, more than Mao, more than the emperors of old, which means today, when anything goes wrong, it's Xi's fault. And with the coronavirus outbreak, we are starting to see more than merely whispers, but a rising tide of discontent as the average Chinese citizen is starting to place blame on the party itself and at the person at the top. And when political systems like where the CCP is today start to experience that sort of criticism, they do not get softer. So I think a more ossified, a more brittle, a harsher future is in immediate store for the Chinese Communist Party, which means that when this breaks, the Chinese Communist Party is going to drive this system into the ground in an attempt to eke out every last little bit of time and power that they possibly can. If you had asked me 5-10 years ago, I would have said that the Chinese have a chance to reform this. They've now conclusively made the decision that reform is not the path, and they are going to utterly destroy their country in an attempt to maintain power.
So what does that look like? Does that look like stepping on the stimulus accelerator until they tap out of capital, and then they just use their surveillance security state to clamp down in a very totalitarian direction, but with 21st century technology?
That is exactly what we've seen with the coronavirus scare.
Yeah, so that's kind of a dry run of what we can imagine.
More ways than one, yes.
Yeah, how do you mean?
Well, from the Chinese point of view, that's exactly what's happening. They've steadily built up these tools for citizen surveillance. They're trying to convince people that you don't necessarily have to have an economic improvement in order to give your loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. Just being Chinese is enough. That works for a while until you, of course, have a nationalist defeat like the virus is handing them right now. But that's only one way that this can go down. Like, we know that they will never reach a consumption-based model because the one-child policy has removed the consumers. That also means that we know that they're becoming ever more economically unviable because their workforce is aging, and so it's becoming more expensive, and they're already experiencing labor shortages. That's another way that this can go down. You can have a shock in the Middle East, which generates an energy crisis, and they import about 80% of their energy. That's another way that this can go down. The Americans could just leave one day and the export industry collapses. That's another way that this could go down. The Japanese could wake up on the wrong side of the bed, scream bonsai, and shut the whole thing down. That's another way that this could go down. The problem with predicting the specifics of China's future is that every pillar that they have used to base their entire modern civilization on is beyond their control. And they're all cracking at the same time. And any one of them is lethal.
Which goes back to your point that they've been one of, if not the greatest beneficiaries of the U.S. internationally led order.
Yeah, in absolute terms,
or the U.S.-led
no
international
question.
order. Yeah. Do you put it past the CCP to have, at the very least, exaggerated their response in order to just kind of run a test of this system to see just how much control they have over the population?
No, I don't think they have ever worried about public responses to the degree that they would feel that they need a dry run. Their general opinion of their own people when it comes to thinking of them as normal. You got to remember that the political history of the West is starkly different. And between the Renaissance and the Awakenings and all that, we actually value what individuals think, whereas the Chinese are much more community oriented. There are pros and there are cons to that. But I don't think that the Chinese have ever been really concerned about implementing a new technology at the state level just to see what the impact is going to be. They've got a goal in mind. They've got some tools. They apply it. That's definitely what they're doing with facial recognition.
What are the risks to the surrounding countries or countries that interact with China, even the United States, of political instability in China that the CCP cannot, at the margin at least, effectively control?
I don't think, from a political and military point of view, for most, the concern is too big. Americans are remarkably self-absorbed, particularly in times of retrenchment like we're in right now. So it would have to get really bad and would have to cross the Pacific for us to honestly even really notice. Japan would see it as cause for celebration, and they're an island nation. They'd be fine. The Southeast Asians in general and the Australians in particular, they definitely take some hits because China is just this great sucking maw for their exports. But ultimately, Southeast Asia has a more stable population profile. They're self-sufficient in most agriculture and energy products. They can grow in a way that's more stable than China's ever was. And so it would be a slower growth. It'd be less dramatic, but it's probably more stable. And after a correction period, I think Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand would actually do very well. The Koreans would probably be the ones to suffer the most economically because they are arguably the most economically integrated country in the world. In relative terms, they've probably actually benefited more from the global order than even the Chinese have. And anything that guts global transport and global trade is going to disproportionately hit the South Koreans. The one exception on military issues is Taiwan. The Chinese military was not designed to fight the United States, but it was designed to conquer Taiwan. And the Taiwanese are the closest of the countries of the first island chain to the mainland and the easiest for the Chinese to reach. And if you were a Chinese state leader in an environment of rising nationalism and economic collapse, and you were looking for something to unite the people against anyone except for yourself, Taiwan is the perfect target.
That's so interesting. So that's basically my question. That was my question, which was, would the CCP use foreign foes as a way to distract the local population? What risk does that pose to neighboring countries? Your point is that China is so weak that that's really not something that most of their neighbors should be concerned about, with the exception of Taiwan. I assume also Hong Kong, which is not exactly a neighbor. It is part of China, but it's a different system. You see Hong Kong as getting fully absorbed.
Yeah, if Hong Kong had thrown their rebellion a decade ago, they probably would have been able to sue for terms and get some extra autonomy. And if Hong Kong had waited another decade, China would have probably been so weak that they could have actually broken away. But doing it this time when everyone in the Chinese government is just paranoid and, honestly, with good reason, that's just bad timing. And they're making themselves a target where the Chinese military is going to be able to move in and claim a nationalist victory. And it's not going to turn out well if you're in Hong Kong.
Couldn't there be a situation in which Hong Kong could become something like Vienna or some sort of territory that China wants to be more open because it suits the leadership?
If the Hong Kongers had done that 10 years ago, it might have led to something like that.
I see.
But not today.
Okay, so I'm going to actually hold off on Japan for now because there's so much to get to. I don't know if I really want to spend too much time on Japan because we sort of touched on it. Maybe we'll get back to it. But let's segue into the Middle East, starting really with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that'll get us into a conversation about Turkey. So what is your view on what happens in the Middle East without the United States' presence there? And what sort of timeline are we looking at here? Is this over the next decade? This is in the decade we're living in now?
Yeah, all of this is over the decade that we're living in now. The two powers that you have to pay attention to, of course, are Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, Iran, as we mentioned, has been raging against the American-led order ever since the Ayatollah came to power in 1979, 1980. And they see the order and America's position in maintaining a static stability in the region as their primary concern. Their belief is if the Americans could be kicked out of the region, then Iran, as the largest population and the greatest military power, could in time kind of roll over all of the other local powers. And it's not that I think this is a dumb position. I think it's actually a fairly good read of the history of the region. Iran, Persia as we used to call it, would expand out every few generations and conquer most of the area. But the Iran of today is not the same as the Persia of old. The Persia of old was a polyglot, multi-ethnic empire in which everyone was basically encouraged to define themselves as Persian. It was, if you will, the United States of the day. It included everyone from everywhere. Every valley had its own identity, and they all worked together towards a Persian goal. Now, we're still talking about the Middle Ages and before. It's not that people weren't beaten or anything like that. And it's not like this was a democracy, but it was relatively egalitarian. What happened in the Age of Empires, however, is that the Europeans came in with their deep water navigation and basically cut Iran out of the entire world. They had been the nexus for what passed as global trade. But as soon as the Portuguese and the Spanish figured out how to bypass this entire region and go interface with the Spice Islands and the Chinese directly, all of a sudden Iran became a nowhere. And all of the wealth that used to flow into it went away, the egalitarianism went away, the wealth went away, the cosmopolitanism went away, and the Iran of today is an empty shell compared to what it was. Now, into this environment, about a century ago, the Iranians discovered oil. And they went from having one of the most sophisticated, varied economies in the world to all of a sudden being a rentier state where there was just one commodity that brought in money and honestly invading armies. And Iran ceased being significant. Iran of the Ayatollahs wants the glory days back, but they don't understand that they need to start from scratch and rebuild the cosmopolitan that used to undergird the old Persian Empire, and that is a century, a 2-century, a 3-century process. So they're stuck with the economy of today and the political system of yesteryear, and that is just not a good combination. So that's kind of piece one, people who are chomping at the bit to get back to the glory days, but they really lack the tools. And so what they do is they just work to undermine the systems of everybody else, cause chaos in order to tear down opposing systems so theirs can rise. On the other side, you've got the Saudis, which are, the Saudis are probably some of the least egalitarian people in the world. We've got there a single family, the Al Sauds, who think of themselves as medieval despots of old, divine right of kings, that sort of thing, and how everyone in their country basically exists to serve their needs. They look at the Persians with concern because in times the Persians have conquered what is today Saudi Arabia, but really it's a lot more visceral than that. The Saudis and their allies, the Wahhabis, used to be desert raiding tribes. They never had much going on. They basically existed by kidnapping and drug smuggling. And then they rose to control this territory that we know as Saudi Arabia, and shortly thereafter, they discovered oil. And so you take this mindset that is kind of the worst of all worlds and all of a sudden make it fabulously wealthy. So there's not a lot of work ethic. There's no technical skills. They bring in foreigners to do everything, but they're mad rich. These are the two forces that are now opposed to each other in the Middle East. And the United States, during the Cold War, managed to make both of them allies. And in the post-Cold War order, managed to keep the Saudis as an ally when they lost the Iranians. Well, that is what the American presence is what has made the Persian Gulf region so calm for the last 70 years. And I got to underline that. Despite all the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, this is the calmest period in this region's history. And the only reason it's been relatively calm is the Americans had to have the oil flowing to power the global order. Now that the Americans don't care, now that the Americans are leaving, this region goes back to the old rivalries. And these two powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are going to be at each other's throats very soon. You could actually argue that the civil war in Syria is kind of the opening gambit in this conflict. The Saudis and the Iranians have backed opposite sides. The Iranians get a lot of flack in the United States for being hyper-violent. They are, but they're not nearly as violent as what the Saudis have done. Because at the end of the day, the Iranians actually want to rule this region, and so they've worked with the standing government of Bashar Assad. The Saudis don't. They know that no one in the region respects them. They know that they lack the institutional capacity to actually rule this region. So they're willing to burn it down, burn it all down if that hurts Iran. So when you look at all these conflicts that are simmering in the region, in Syria and Afghanistan, in Iraq and Yemen, this is what they are in a moment of calm. When the Saudis still have some hope that the Americans are going to remain engaged and impose some sort of stability on the region from the outside. As soon as the Saudis give up on that hope, the gloves come off and this gets serious.
So how does this escalate? Because you mentioned Syria. They've been engaged in proxy wars and terror attacks up until now. What constitutes an escalation, and can Saudi Arabia afford to escalate this without a new sponsor in the event that the U.S. really does check out?
I would argue that the Iranians are doing everything that they can, that they're, if anything, overexposed right now. So their ability to surge violence into this region, I don't think it exists. That doesn't mean that they're done by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they've pushed as hard as they possibly can. They might be able to maintain this tempo, but I don't think they can increase it. The Saudis absolutely can. The Saudis conservatively have $2 trillion saved up in their sovereign wealth funds, not all of which is on the books. They also, every once in a while, prune minor branches of the family tree and throw princes in prison and take all their cash. So their ability to ramp up what they're doing is extreme. Keep in mind that some of the backroom quiet militant groups that the Saudis have spawned and unleashed upon their enemies in the past include groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So their capacity for it, just with a few weeks' notice, to go up and stir up a lot of trouble, throw a lot of cash at a militant group, provide them with a little bit of intelligence and weapons, that's almost bottomless. And the only reason it hasn't been more is because they think that the Americans might not be ready to leave. Now, as soon as the Americans do formally leave, they're going to try to find a new sponsor, but really there aren't a lot of players. The Europeans and the Asians really don't have the staying power to play a role, and certainly don't have the deployable militaries in terms of getting a large army to the region to make a difference. Turkey's a possibility, but honestly, the Turks think as badly of the Saudis, I think, as I do. The best bet is probably Israel. Israel is of the firm belief that if we can get various members of the Islamic world fighting each other, then they're not going to have the spare bandwidth to go after the Jewish state. And that's probably a really good plan. So they're providing already the Saudis with weapons training, with some equipment that the Americans won't give them, with time on target intelligence. They're stirring up groups around the region in parallel with the Saudis to a little degree. Geopolitics makes strange bedfellows.
So what does that mean for example, the jihadists in the region? If they weren't happy with the U.S. stationing troops in Saudi Arabia ahead of Gulf War I, how are they going to feel about an alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Well, the Israelis and the Saudis are never going to have a signed document, and there's never, ever going to be an Israeli base in Saudi Arabia. They've done a very good job at keeping this relatively low profile from a PR point of view, but it's pretty safe to say that most of the Arab world nations today actually prefer working with Israel to Iran. They don't see the Israelis as wanting to conquer them, and that makes all the difference. If you're a jihadi group, you might have a different interpretation of that, but remember that most Sunni jihadi groups, including ISIS, including Al-Qaeda, consider Iran a more hateful enemy than the United States.
So, Peter, I want to move us into the overtime for the second hour of this conversation. Before I do, I have one more question about Iran, and that has to do with their nuclear program. What happens to their nuclear program in this environment?
It's hard to tell. I mean, it's 1940s technology. It's not all that hard. It's not that I doubt that the Iranians can make a functional nuclear device, but having a nuclear device and having a fully weaponized systems, those are two very different things. The missile program is harder than the nuclear program because you have to miniaturize, ruggedize whatever the device is. That I am unclear whether the Iranians can manage it. But if it ever does appear that the Iranians are getting close, I can guarantee you that the Saudis will go to either Israel or Pakistan and just buy a few.
Wow. You're saying the Saudis would use nukes on Iran as a preemptive strike?
In a heartbeat. I mean, you got to remember, the United States developed a nuclear weapon during World War II because we didn't think we could win the conventional fight. We didn't nuke Germany because that ultimately became a land war where we had the preponderance of power, and we didn't nuke them. In Japan, we were going to have to do an amphibious landing of the home islands, and we were projecting in excess of 1 million casualties. That was too high a price, so we went with the nuclear option. The countries that use nukes are not the ones that think they can win the conventional fight. So in a straight up fight in the desert between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Iranians would win hand down. They've got a larger army. They might not be as well equipped, but they actually have people who know how to fight. The Saudi army probably wouldn't do very well outside of an air-conditioned garage. So the Saudis would go with nukes. And you can replay that anywhere in the world. I don't worry about Chinese nukes. I worry about Taiwanese nukes. I don't worry about Russian nukes. I worry about Polish nukes.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So I want to make a few comments before I move us to the second hour. One, your book does a phenomenal job of highlighting geography. We haven't even begun to do it justice in this conversation. I just wanted to point that out for listeners because I do highly, highly recommend your book. Also, demographics. We've covered demographics in our episodes on China. We've done a number of those episodes. Demographics are front and center in your book. They are so important. So are resources and oil, natural gas, and agriculture. So I just wanted to highlight those things. So, Peter, the things that I want to get into in the overtime, I want to kind of shift the conversation from Iran and Saudi Arabia and move it to Turkey. Because of all the countries in your book, Turkey is the most fascinating. Their future is the most up for grabs, it seems. They could go in any direction. There are so many options. It's really unclear. There's huge opportunity for Turkey, and also they could end up bogged down in the Middle East and end up just stuck there for the next decade or two. There's also Argentina, fascinating. I think especially for anyone who's an investor out there who looks for interesting new opportunities abroad. Argentina has always presented those, but I think what's really interesting is the case that you make for Argentina in this new world. It's absolutely fascinating. It's very detailed, and I want to get into that. And to the extent that we have an opportunity to talk about Germany, the decline of Germany in this environment, and the rise of France, and of course, the United States. We will have to talk about that, the future of U.S. foreign policy. So for regular listeners, you know the drill. If you're new to the program, or if you haven't subscribed yet to our audiophile, autodidact, or super nerd tiers, head over to patreon.com/hidden forces, or scroll down to the bottom of the summary text to this week's episode and click on the link that takes you directly to our Patreon page, as well as on the link with instructions on how to integrate the RSS overtime feed with your favorite podcast application of choice. Peter, stick around and we'll be right back on the other side of the overtime. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Creative Media Design Studio in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hidden forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.